Thank you so much for this kind introduction, and of course thank you very, very much for the invitation to Leiden. I did not know, I have to admit, how pretty Leiden was. I'd like to explore the city some more. Unfortunately, I have to run after my presentation. I have to catch a plane. I will be talking about video games in the museum, about the significance of video games as cultural artifacts. I will start by just talking about the history of video games in the context of ZKM, Center for Art and Media in Karlsruhe. Because ever since our Center for Art and Media in Karlsruhe has opened its doors in 1997 in a former ammunitions factory, by the way, we display and present video games as part of our exhibition program. We identified them very early as an integral part of an everyday digital world and digital life. Here, the ZKM has assumed a pioneering role. By contrast, it is only since November 2012 that New York's Museum of Modern Art has included computer and video games in its collection, mainly focusing on the aspect of interaction design. So, early on, Center for Art and Media recognized the importance of video games and how influential they are. In 1995, an educator and social worker called Friedemann Schindler and the designer Frank den Oudsten, they started to develop a concept for an exhibition that would portray the different levels of the medium of the video game, which they identified as multi-layered. So we have here a historic photograph from 1997 showing the first video games at ZKM. So the first exhibition featuring video games at ZKM was called Welt der Spiele, World of Games, and it was strongly influenced by an educational approach to media. The curators addressed various complexes of issues in the form of installations. For example, we see here an installation called License to Kill. It engages, of course, with the portrayal of violence in mass media. And this one here is particularly interesting. You could play the first-person shooter Doom in the museum, but you had to sit down in these dentist chairs in order to emphasize the violent nature of the game. Today, of course, it's a little bit different, but Welt der Spiele, the World of Games exhibition, provided the basis for my work at ZKM conceptualizing a new exhibition called ZKM Gameplay. You saw some moving images already from that exhibition, and here I have some photographs. Video games have evolved, of course, since 1997 and are now very different to those from the early days. Classics like Pong from 1972 and Pac-Man from 1980 and contemporary games like, for example, Destiny or The Witcher 3 or whatever are worlds apart technically, aesthetically, and of course all above commercially. Video games now exist in a diversity of variations, genres, and multifaceted forms, as well as various art scenes. And they are now a very complex, highly complex medium. In the course of their history, the video games have developed their own specific repertoire of forms and forms of expression, of course. Gameplay, my first video game exhibition at ZKM, traced these developments and presented the video game as a medium that has achieved its own identity and now entered a phase in which reflection played a defining role, and self-reflection even of the medium itself. In gameplay, the medium of the video game, or my goal was to interrogate the medium and to show the potentialities of the video game, to put them in focus and not cementing its conventions. The selection of exhibits prioritizes experimental, unconventional, and artistic forms of the video game. Concentrating on these potentialities of the medium demonstrates how diverse the subject is and at the same time allows its characteristics to emerge clearly. So the idea of reflecting on the medium played a definitive role in the new conception of the exhibition called Gameplay. The games are subjected to critical scrutiny. We have, of course, people working at ZKM who do guided tours, who work with children and do all these communications work, and they were, or I worked very, very closely with them together in order to develop workshops, special tours, and so on. So. The exhibition Gameplay presented the exhibited video games and artworks in an interactive, playable form where feasible. Visitors are invited to play the games together and to engage with the works of game art. A game that is not being played is in a curious state of limbo, one could say. An unplayed video game or game only exists as a static thing, and is in fact a very sad thing if you imagine a not played or unplayed game. So only when it is played, the game can develop its potential. For the theory of video games, Alexander Galloway, professor in New York, put it in a nutshell when he said video games are actions. And that is precisely what the exhibition stands for. So, since the original conception for the exhibition Welt der Spiele, World of Games, there have been developments in science, scholarship, art and commerce, and these have considerably influenced the new conception of gameplay. In view of the huge cultural and economic significance of video games, not only artists have started to explore their potentials, like, for example, Jody or Cory Archangel, for example, but also a branch of academic inquiry has developed. Game studies, this emerging field, are concerned with the critical study of games, including engaging with the question of the meanings of computer games, which is by no means confined to a purely educational perspective. One of the rediscovered father figures of recent game studies, by the way, is Johan Huizinga. I learned how to pronounce it correctly. He, of course, is one of the, rediscovered father figures of recent game studies. So, game studies, which began to form in 1999, view video games as a rich and multi-layered subject investigating expressive artifacts. The theoretical work that has come out of game studies was an important basis for developing gameplay. In the course of developing game theory, art historians, in isolated cases like myself, began to take an interest in the subject from a critical standpoint. The most important outcome, or one of the most important outcomes of this work, was to establish that there is indeed a close relationship between interactive media art and games. Lisa asked me beforehand to include some remarks regarding the topic of collecting and preserving video games in the context of a museum. And we face problems here and questions that are not yet solved and will keep us occupied in the next years, I'm sure. I have no solution, by the way, I'm afraid, but I can give you a short overview about the challenges we're facing. There are different approaches of collecting video games at the moment. The easiest way, of course, is just to buy the games. They come in a box, put a signature on them and put them in a library of some sort. The main problem here, of course, is that we have to deal with already obsolescence. Games as born digital artifacts that may have been released only a couple of years ago might already been obsolete because they run on obsolete formats or platforms. Already, we need specified media archaeological methods to unravel the mysteries of digital obsolescence, already, now. And this will be, of course, a huge preservatorial problem in the future, I'm sure, if we want to guarantee that digital artifacts will not vanish. The next problem is a shift in the distribution of video games. A lot of games at the moment are distributed exclusively via download on the internet and are only accessible through specialized software libraries, like, for example, Steam, that will be obsolete sooner or later themselves. A lot of games change over the time of their lifespan with updates, patches, additional downloadable content, and so on. And this is a huge challenge in the context of preservation. Is it necessary to preserve every software version of a game, version 1.0, 2.7, and so on? So against obsolescence, there are two basic strategies. The first one is preserving the game's source codes. Preserving the source codes leads to a variety of new problems, I'm afraid. Most of the published video games are made by corporations. That means we have to deal with proprietary software, meaning it's licensed software owned by the corporations. And if a museum goes there to a corporation and says, okay, can I have your source code? They will deny, I'm sure. There are open source games, of course, but the majority are products by companies. Artists, on the other hand, are not so keen on giving away their source codes either. Recently, I have bought an artistic video game installation for ZKM by a Dutch artist, Lieven van Veldhoven. The ZKM, it's in the contract, it receives a copy of the source code in the case of the artist's death. So, even if a museum is in the possession of a video game's source code, it is not clear if the codes can be easily compiled in the future. MoMA acquired the source code of Tetris by Alexei Pachitnov, which is a great thing. But if this code will be executable in, let's say, 100 years or 10 years, or I don't know, it is completely unclear. You need, new professions, basically, in the future. Media archaeologists, programmers that are specialized on digging up the lost digital artifacts, like the paintings Andy Warhol did on an Amiga in the early 80s, and this was a project by Golan Levin and Cory Archangel, and they managed to make these data visible. It's not about a video game, but I think my point is clear, because this data was lost, and they had to invent methods in order to make this data executable and visible again. So first strategy, by source codes. Other strategies to emulate the games. making them executable on other computer systems than they have been originally designed for. And that, of course, is a massive technical challenge. Here we have the classic dilemma, by the way, of the care and preservation of ancient monuments between conservation and reconstruction. So it's the same here. The next problem is the gigantic complexity and vastness of so-called MMOs, so-called massively multiplayer online games, like, for example, the most famous is World of Warcraft. It's a role-playing game played by literally millions of people simultaneously in the world. They are connected via a vast network of personal computers and servers, and it is impossible, in my opinion, to save, to store, and make visible all the data that is generated in a meaningful way. I have read that MoMA has an exhibit about World of Warcraft. They tried, it is unpresentable, basically, this artifact. Is it an artifact? I don't know. It's a network, basically. And they tried to solve the problem by storytelling. They produced a documentary about the game in which veterans talk about the time they spent immersed in the game world. And that leads me to the next topic. I was asked by Lisa beforehand the role of ethnographic museums and the discipline of ethnography in relation to video games. And video games, and especially game worlds, MMOs, are a dedicated ethnographical subject, not only from the view of preserving them, but rather the worlds and communities themselves. When researchers were faced, in the early days of game studies, were faced with a new complex artifact of a virtual world, virtual game world, with its own complexity, they quickly discovered ethnography as a method of choice. Through ethnography, the complexity of the world's inhabitants, social structures, and culture can be grasped by conducting field studies. So, because it's really closed communities, cultures that have emerged and that have, emerged out of the rule systems and the environments of the virtual worlds. So a task of an ethnographical museum of the future could be not only to preserve the digital artifacts and communities, but rather the culture of the virtual society that evolved from the artifact and surrounds it. In 2014, I opened a newly developed exhibition for ZKM called Global Games, in the context of ZKM's 300-day art festival, Globale. It's about digitization and globalization, basically. Core elements of Globale are visible in video games too, so I curated this with a question, how can we see effects of globalization and digitization in video games? Computer games, of course, are a child of the digital revolution and thus a medium produced by digitization par excellence. Moreover, the apparent paradox of serious play in so-called serious games evidences not only the scientification of our culture and the trend towards new tools, but also a new alliance between art and science. And this is one media theoretical standpoint that Peter Weibel, my boss, actually stands for. Computer games transport real-world references, meanings, and ideologies, and can hence function as political and social media. Social media not in the sense of Facebook, but socially relevant media, in a positive, enlightening way, or in the sense of seductive propaganda, of course. Games thematize such topics as the Syrian conflict, for example, the deployment of drones in war zones, for example here. Italian video game designer Paolo Pedaccini, La Mole Industria, did this game called Unmanned about a a drone pilot who suffers from from the fear of castration. So it's a psychogram of a drone pilot. We have video games that thematize a globalized economic interconnectedness of international finance, like in Card Life. We have video games that show us effects of surveillance, or that show us the situation of refugees on the European borders or in Africa. They open, some game designers and some games are open for gender issues, like this wonderful example here. This is Dysphoria by Ananthropy, a transgender game designer, born male, who chose a video game as her form of expression and thinking or telling the story of her hormone treatment through the means of a video game. A lot of gameplay metaphors here. Everybody is familiar with Tetris, I think, and she does this beautiful gameplay mechanics metaphor, taking a Tetris block that won't fit. And she says, I feel weird about my body. And this is such a beautiful gameplay metaphor in the game. This game here is called Papers, Please, and you have to control passports in this game. In this fictitious state called Arstotzka, in 1982 in the Cold War, and you see that while playing the game that you get drawn into this political system that is depicted in the game, and not only depicted but simulated by the rule system of the game. Video games show us history lessons, like Peter Brinsen's The Cat and the Coop, about the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was... there was a coup orchestrated by the CIA. Why he wasn't oh, now my English is gone at the moment. Well, he was not prime minister anymore. Ludwig is a game that is a tool for learning. You can learn physics with this game, and this is done in schools, for example. Oh, 5 minutes, okay. So, I skip 2 now. In this game here, Biotic Games by Seth Cooper, University of Washington, he puts euglena in a Petri dish, and you can control these euglena because they are light sensitive, and by switching on lights on the sides of the Petri dish, you can indirectly control the euglena. And he does very fun soccer games with these little animals. This game here is particularly interesting. A phone story by Paolo Pedercini, and this game shows the production processes of an iPhone. It is played on an iPhone, ideally, and the left image shows how Chinese workers try to kill themselves by by jumping from the factories in China, and you have to catch them, but not to save them, but in order that they can go back to work. And the right image shows that you have to force your children, slave workers in the Congo, to keep mining rare earths. In order to build your smartphone, and this game was downloadable on the Apple App Store for 4 days, and then it was censored. It was forbidden by Apple because the official statement was that there is violence depicted against children. One thing is evident. Computer games are or can be political media, and that they apply their own specific means to topics of social and global political relevance. They do so, on the one hand, in an enlightened manner within the context of, for example, the Games for Change movement, and conversely, the procedural rhetoric is also used as propaganda, as demonstrated, for example, in a game called America's Army, that is commissioned by the US government as a recruiting tool and distributed free of charge. So the connection between computer games and the military context, the military entertainment industrial complex, goes all the way back to the early days of the medium. This is the first video game we know. It's called Tennis for Two. It's from 1958. And this was invented by US physicist William Higginbotham. He constructed the video game Tennis for Two, the prototype of all video games in the context of an open doors day of his laboratory. In 1945, Higginbotham headed the electronics department, by the way, of the Manhattan Project in Los Alamos, in New Mexico. And in this context, the invention of the computer game has been called an arms byproduct, so Rüstungsabfall in German. In his media theoretical commentary, Friedrich Kittler generalizes with respect to the military industry and the media, quote, "The entertainment industry is, in any conceivable sense of the word, an abuse of army equipment." So in German, Unterhaltungsindustrie ist in jedem Wortsinn Missbrauch von Heeresgerät. In the independent scene, independent video game scene, there are signs of an emerging awareness for anti-war games, as demonstrated, for example, by This War of Mine, by a Polish game company, with a change of perspective in the game, because usually in mainstream video games you play the soldier in a war zone, but here you play a group of civilians. You have to survive in a post-war zone. September 12th by Gonzalo Frasca, Uruguayan game scholar and designer, uses the simple caricature to present the spiral of violence propelled and entrenched by the US war on terror. This here is interesting. It's called Faith Fighter. While referencing such genre classics as Street Fighter II, this beat-em-up game does an ironic take on their stereotypical and even racist portrayal of fighters from around the world, and as it pits representatives of the major world religions against each other. Jesus faces off against, among others, Buddha and Muhammad. The game has a playable caricature of the prophet. It is, of course, an ethical and political question whether the game should be exhibited. At ZKM, we show a censored version in which the prophet's face is obscured. I know you have the sign, but one more example. Computer games are not a purely Western phenomenon. We must consider them as a global medium, and games are produced and played all over the world. Little known are computer game productions from the Arab world and the Near East. Two noteworthy examples are from Syria and Iran. Here, published by Syrian game developer Dar al-Fikr, and played from a Palestinian perspective, the shooter Under Ash stages the battle against Israel during the Second Intifada from 1999 to 2002. And the Iran Computer and Video Games Foundation promotes Iranian games, presenting them at such computer game trade fairs as the Gamescom, for example, in Cologne. And now my last remark is about considering the example of Under Ash, this game, Under Ash. We clearly see that games, both serious and commercial games, are ideological political spaces. They frame our perspective on the other, and they are virtual worlds that aim to convince players of certain ideas. Contrasting Under Ash with the example of the game America's Army here that I mentioned before makes my point even clearer. America's Army is a game that was commissioned by the US Army as a marketing and recruiting tool. You can play as an American soldier against so-called opposing forces that are not identified any further. It is a multiplayer game. One significant aspect of the game is that a player can only play as a US soldier, never as the enemy. Meaning, if two people play against each other, each one sees herself as American, although the other is always depicted as the enemy. This perspective is unchangeable, hardwired in the program's code. Under Ash and America's Army present two different concepts of the enemy that are politically motivated, of course. The examples show that we as researchers have a responsibility putting video games under critical scrutiny. Thanks.